A single empire in Europe would one day command over a quarter of the planet's land and population. Its foundations were laid on the lands of England under the power of a formidable British monarchy, sparking an extraordinary story of exploration, conquest, and global dominance. The British Empire witnessed some of humanity's greatest achievements and triumphs, yet also revealed its darkest sides. Following the discovery of America roughly 500 years ago, the British ventured into the oceans, encountering unfamiliar civilizations and forging both historic alliances and fierce rivalries. Within 4 centuries, this empire would be valued at over $600 billion. But how did an empire that once ruled territories across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and even Australia eventually fall? To understand that, we must return to its beginnings. Long before the Age of Exploration, a man named King Alfred the Great defended the Anglo-Saxon kingdom from invading Danish Vikings. In 878 AD, after suffering initial defeats, Alfred was forced to retreat to the marshlands of Somerset, where he sought refuge on the Isle of Athelney. There, he regrouped and rallied his loyal followers, forming a strong army. In a decisive battle at Edington, Alfred defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. The victory led to the Treaty of Wedmore, which established the Danelaw, a region of England under official Viking rule, while securing peace between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred then began the process of unifying the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, a mission completed by his grandson Athelstan in 924 AD, when he ascended to the throne of Wessex. Athelstan's rule faced opposition from rival claimants, particularly in the Viking-controlled territories of Northumbria and Mercia. Yet he proved to be a capable and determined leader. In 927 AD, Athelstan conquered Northumbria, effectively uniting England under his rule and becoming the first true king of a unified England. 2 centuries later, the next major chapter unfolded. King Henry II of England sought to expand his dominion to Ireland. In the spring of 1171, accompanied by a retinue of knights and soldiers, Henry sailed from England to Waterford, Ireland. Upon arrival, he swiftly asserted his authority, demanding the submission of Irish kings and chieftains. Determined to establish firm English control, Henry insisted that the Irish rulers acknowledge his sovereignty, marking the beginning of England's long and complex relationship with Ireland. The reactions of the Irish leaders were mixed. However, when various Irish bishops and clergymen met at the Synod of Cashel in 1171, they recognized King Henry II as the sovereign ruler of Ireland, formally acknowledging his authority over the island. This moment marked Ireland as the first colony of England, long before anyone could imagine a global British Empire. 2 centuries later, in 1277, King Edward I of England sought to bring Wales under his dominion and integrate it into his kingdom. His ambitions were driven by strategic, political, and territorial motives. The campaign began with the First Welsh War. Edward launched a determined invasion into Gwynedd, the heartland of Welsh resistance in North Wales. Despite fierce opposition, the Welsh forces were ultimately defeated, and their ruler, Prince Llewellyn, was compelled to submit to Edward's authority. Having established dominance in Gwynedd, Edward first turned his focus to solidifying control over all of Wales. Recognizing that military conquest alone could not suppress Welsh resistance, he devised a multifaceted strategy. One of his key initiatives was the construction of an extensive network of imposing castles and fortresses across Wales, structures that would serve as enduring symbols of English power and as strongholds to maintain order. Yet Welsh resistance persisted. In 1282, a second uprising ignited, sparking what became known as the Second Welsh War. The conflict was fierce and unrelenting, but the Welsh were ultimately overcome. With the defeat of their forces, Edward I consolidated his conquest, officially incorporating Wales into the Kingdom of England. England's struggles, however, were far from over. Between 1337 and 1453, England and France became locked in the Hundred Years' War, a prolonged and devastating conflict that drained both nations and left England confined largely to its island territories. No sooner had that war ended than England was plunged into another internal conflict. The infamous Wars of the Roses, fought between the rival House of Lancaster and the House of York from 1455 to 1487. The bloody dynastic struggle finally concluded with victory for the Lancastrians, and Henry VI was declared king. While England wrestled with turmoil at home, the rest of the world was beginning to open up to new possibilities. In 1492, Christopher Columbus embarked on his legendary voyage across the Atlantic, eventually landing in the Bahamas. Following his initial discovery, he explored several other islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola, the island that today is shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Cabot's voyages also reached the coasts of present-day Central and South America, including areas of modern Venezuela and Panama. The revelation of this vast new continent ignited Britain's ambition to secure a foothold in the New World. Intrigued by the prospect of expanding English influence, King Henry granted Cabot a royal patent authorizing him to claim any newly discovered territories in the name of the English crown. In May 1497, Cabot set sail from Bristol aboard a small ship named the Matthew, accompanied by a crew of about 18 men. The journey across the Atlantic was fraught with hardship, unpredictable storms, icy winds, and the ever-present uncertainty of what lay beyond the horizon. After several grueling weeks at sea, on June 24, 1497, Cabot and his crew finally sighted land. They had reached the eastern coast of North America in a region later known as Newfoundland, literally, Newfound Land. The explorers were awed by the unfamiliar terrain and encountered indigenous peoples, likely the Beothuk or Micmac, who had inhabited these lands for millennia. Cabot planted the English flag upon the shore, formally claiming the territory for England and marking the first recorded English landing in the New World. The duration of Cabot's stay remains uncertain, though historians believe he spent only a short time exploring the coastline before setting sail for home. When he returned to Bristol in August 1497, he was celebrated as a national hero. His success stirred excitement throughout Europe, as news of England's newfound claim to western lands spread rapidly. The voyage inspired hopes of finding a westward passage to Asia and positioned England as a new contender in the race for overseas discovery and trade. Buoyed by his achievement, Cabot embarked on a second expedition in 1498, this time likely intending to explore further south and consolidate England's territorial claims. However, the fate of this voyage remains one of history's mysteries. Some accounts suggest he reached the North American mainland again. Others say his ships were lost to the Atlantic, never to return. Meanwhile, back in England, the Tudor dynasty was entering a pivotal chapter. King Henry VIII had married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess and daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. In the early years, their union appeared harmonious, and Henry remained a devout follower of the Catholic Church. Yet as time passed, the king became increasingly tormented by a grave dilemma. His marriage had produced no surviving male heir. The absence of a son threatened the stability of the Tudor line and the future of England's monarchy, setting the stage for one of the most transformative. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary. The king's longing for a male heir soon consumed him, leading him to believe that his union with Catherine was cursed in the eyes of God. Convinced that their marriage was invalid, Henry turned to the Pope, pleading for an annulment. He argued that his marriage violated divine law, as Catherine had once been married to his late brother, Prince Arthur. According to the Old Testament, a man was forbidden to wed his brother's widow, and Henry believed that this transgression had prevented him from fathering a son. Yet his appeals to Rome were met with resistance. The Pope, swayed by political pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, refused to dissolve the marriage. Frustration and pride overcame the king. In a radical and unprecedented move, Henry VIII resolved to sever England's allegiance to the Roman Catholic Church. In 1534, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the king the supreme head of the Church of England and ending papal authority over English affairs. This marked the birth of Anglicanism and the beginning of a new national identity. An English citizen was born, no longer beholden to Rome. In the years that followed, Henry's personal life became as infamous as his political legacy. His subsequent marriages, many ending in divorce or execution, were driven by his unrelenting quest for a male heir. Upon his death, his daughter Mary, born of Catherine of Aragon, ascended the throne as Mary I. Determined to restore Catholicism, she unleashed a brutal persecution of Protestants, earning her the notorious moniker Bloody Mary. Her reign, however, was short-lived. Upon her death in 1558, her half-sister Elizabeth I rose to power, ushering in a golden age for England. A staunch Protestant, Elizabeth reaffirmed her father's religious reforms. In 1559, she enacted a new Act of Supremacy, naming herself Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and passed the Act of Uniformity, which established the Book of Common Prayer as the official liturgy across the nation. While England consolidated its spiritual and political power at home, beyond its shores, a global race for empire was already underway. The Spanish had established vast colonies across the Americas, expanding their wealth from the ruins of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to the heights of Machu Picchu in Peru and across the Andes Mountains of Chile to the Brazilian coast. The age of exploration had ignited a fierce competition, one that would soon draw England into its center. The Portuguese, too, had established a formidable presence in the New World, founding settlements such as Salvador de Pernambuco and Rio de Janeiro along the Brazilian coast. The French, meanwhile, carved out colonies in the north, most notably in Quebec, and briefly held small territories in Florida, including Fort Caroline. The global race for empire was accelerating, and England, under Queen Elizabeth I, was eager to join. Determined to expand England's influence and weaken Spain's dominance at sea, Queen Elizabeth commissioned a daring group of privateers, known colloquially as the Sea Dogs. These mariners were granted royal authorization to raid, plunder, and capture Spanish ships and colonies under the guise of advancing English interests. Their exploits were as much acts of piracy as they were of patriotism, forming the foundation of England's future naval supremacy. Among the first of these seafarers was John Hawkins, a ruthless but skilled navigator whose career would mark the beginning of England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. In 1561, Hawkins joined the Royal Navy, and soon after, his travels took him to the Canary Islands, a Spanish colony off the coast of Africa. There, he witnessed firsthand the lucrative trade in enslaved Africans, a discovery that would forever alter the course of English maritime history. In 1562, Hawkins organized his first voyage to West Africa. Sailing along the coast of Sierra Leone, he captured roughly 300 Africans, imprisoning them aboard his ship. Without permission from either Spain or Portugal to trade within their colonial territories, Hawkins nonetheless sailed to the Caribbean, where he illicitly sold his human cargo in places such as Isabela, Puerto de Plata, and Monte Cristi, settlements where colonial authorities turned a blind eye to unauthorized trade. In exchange, he received pearls, hides, and sugar. His profits were immense. When Hawkins returned to England, his success earned him royal favor, and he was eventually knighted for his service to the crown. Encouraged by this, he launched a second voyage in 1564, again targeting Sierra Leone. This time, he seized over 400 Africans, some purchased from Portuguese traders, others violently kidnapped in coastal raids. By early 1565, Hawkins arrived in Borborada, Venezuela, where trade with foreigners was forbidden. Using threats of force, he coerced the local authorities into allowing his transactions. He then sailed to Rio de la Hacha, where he once more used intimidation to ensure compliance. There, he sold 300 enslaved people in exchange for gold, silver, and other precious goods, and even secured promises for future trade. However, his third voyage in 1567 proved far more perilous. Due to a Portuguese embargo, Hawkins was unable to procure captives along the African coast. In desperation, he attacked a village near Cape Verde, but was wounded during the raid. He later allied with a local king in Sierra Leone to forcibly capture more people, amassing over 500 captives. In February 1568, he set sail across the Atlantic once more, selling his human cargo in the provinces of Margarita and Borborada. When the governor of Rio de la Hacha refused him permission to trade, Hawkins and his second-in-command, Francis Drake, retaliated violently, bombarding the governor's residence and seizing the town by force before selling their captives during their retreat. These brutal voyages marked the early beginnings of England's entanglement in the transatlantic slave trade, a dark enterprise that would expand over the next 3 centuries and underpin the economic foundation of the British Empire. Hawkins' voyage soon met disaster. Driven into the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua by a violent storm, his battered fleet sought refuge and attempted to negotiate peace with the Spanish authorities. But as the talks unfolded, Spanish cannons suddenly thundered to life. Explosions shattered the harbor as cannonballs tore through the air toward the English ships. Though heavily outnumbered, Hawkins' men fought back with fierce determination. His fleet maneuvered skillfully under fire, returning volleys with their own cannons. The sea battle raged intensely, a deadly clash of nations on foreign shores. When the smoke cleared, many English ships lay in ruins. Faced with overwhelming odds, Hawkins and his men had to make a fateful choice: retreat or face lifelong imprisonment in the Spanish galleys. In the end, 114 Englishmen were captured, while Hawkins and a handful of survivors, including Francis Drake, escaped. They limped back to England, battered but richer from their dealings. Regardless of its moral cost, the transatlantic slave trade had proven lucrative, and English merchants were determined to expand it, whatever the human price. By 1577, Queen Elizabeth I sought new horizons. She commissioned Francis Drake to lead an ambitious voyage to find a trade route to Asia by sailing around the newly discovered Americas. Unlike earlier explorers, Drake was aware of the vast American continents and aimed to circumvent them entirely by navigating south around Cape Horn, the perilous southern tip of South America. The expedition faced nature's fury. Ferocious winds howled, and waves towered like mountains, testing the courage and unity of the crew. Yet, under Drake's resolute command, they endured the tempest and successfully navigated through the Strait of Magellan, emerging into the vast and uncharted waters of the Pacific Ocean. Sailing northward along the western coast of South America, Drake and his men marveled at the new lands they encountered: rugged coastlines, lush landscapes, and unfamiliar wildlife that stirred their curiosity and awe. Their journey eventually brought them to the shores of modern-day California, where they made landfall in a place of striking beauty and abundance. Drake named it Nova Albion, meaning New England, in honor of his homeland. Their voyage continued westward across the Pacific, leading them to the Spice Islands, present-day Indonesia, renowned for their riches in cloves, nutmeg, and exotic goods. There, they traded amicably with local merchants, exchanging English textiles and metal goods for fragrant spices and treasures. The homeward journey was long and perilous. Crossing the immense expanse of the Indian Ocean, the crew battled unpredictable weather and dwindling supplies. Yet Drake's leadership and seamanship guided them safely around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. After nearly 3 years at sea, their ship, the Golden Hind, triumphantly returned to England in September 1580. Drake had become the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. His daring voyage not only brought him immense fame and fortune, but also marked the dawn of England's emergence as a global maritime power. As England looked upon the vast potential of the New World, it became clear that if the nation sought to grow into a true empire, it would need to establish permanent colonies overseas. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a royal charter to explore, claim, and settle lands in the New World on behalf of the English crown. Acting on this commission, Raleigh organized an expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville, who set sail for Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The group, comprising about 100 men, including soldiers, scientists, and skilled artisans, arrived in 1585. They built a small fort and began to interact with the local indigenous tribes. Initially, relations between the English settlers and the Native Americans were cordial. The two groups exchanged goods and knowledge, establishing a fragile cooperation. However, as time passed, the colonists faced severe hardships. Disease, dwindling food supplies, and harsh conditions eroded morale. Misunderstandings and mistrust deepened the rift between settlers and the native population, leading to tension and conflict. Amid these struggles, Sir Francis Drake, returning to England after another triumphant privateering voyage against the Spanish, stopped by Roanoke in 1586. Seeing the settlers' desperation, he offered to take them back home. Weary and disheartened, most accepted, abandoning the colony and returning to England. Raleigh made another attempt the following year, sending 118 settlers to re-establish the settlement. Yet when a resupply mission returned 3 years later, The colony was found completely deserted, its fate shrouded in mystery as the infamous lost colony of Roanoke. Even as these colonial ventures faltered, tensions with Spain reached a breaking point. By 1588, King Philip II of Spain viewed it as his divine duty to invade England and restore it to Catholicism. To accomplish this, he assembled one of the most formidable naval forces in history, the Spanish Armada. Comprising about 130 ships, including heavily armed galleons that formed the backbone of Spain's maritime power, the Armada carried more than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines. The Spanish envisioned a crushing victory that would end Protestant England and place the island under Spanish control. Across the English Channel, Queen Elizabeth and her advisors were fully aware of the looming threat. She called upon her most capable commanders, Sir Francis Drake and Vice Admiral Charles Howard, to prepare the English fleet for defense. Though vastly outnumbered and commanding smaller ships, the English Navy possessed key advantages: superior maneuverability, faster vessels, and highly effective long-range cannons. In the late spring of 1588, the mighty Armada set sail toward England, confident in its power. But the English had devised a cunning strategy. Employing their smaller, more agile ships, they harassed the Spanish formation along the coast. The English vessels attacked from the rear, unleashing devastating broadsides before swiftly retreating beyond the range of the slower Spanish guns. These hit-and-run tactics exploited the Armada's size and rigidity, turning the strength of Spain's fleet into its greatest weakness. As the Spanish fleet advanced into the English Channel, the English Navy executed a daring and ingenious maneuver. Under the cover of night, they sent 8 fire ships, old vessels packed with pitch, tar, and other flammable materials, drifting toward the anchored Armada. The sight of flaming ships cutting through the darkness sent waves of panic through the Spanish ranks. Fearing their powder magazines would ignite, Spanish captains hastily cut their anchors and scattered to avoid the infernos. The once mighty formation was thrown into chaos, giving the English fleet a crucial tactical advantage. The decisive encounter came soon after, on July 29, 1588, off the coast of Gravelines, France. Here, the English fleet engaged the disorganized Armada in a ferocious battle that would determine the fate of both nations. English gunners unleashed devastating volleys from long-range cannons, while smaller vessels darted in to deliver rapid assaults. Innovative tactics, such as the use of grappling hooks, chain shot, and close-range musket fire, allowed the English to exploit the Spaniards' rigid formations. After hours of brutal fighting, the Spanish fleet was battered and disoriented. Its once proud galleons, heavy and cumbersome, struggled to maneuver against the swift English ships. As the battle dragged on, the Spanish attempted to regroup and flee northward, but the relentless English pursuit and the unforgiving sea turned their retreat into a nightmare. Weakened, low on supplies, and demoralized, the Armada tried to sail home by navigating around Scotland and Ireland. However, fierce Atlantic storms and treacherous currents ravaged the fleet. Many ships were wrecked along the rocky coasts. Thousands of sailors perished from exposure, starvation, or drowning. By the time the surviving vessels limped back to Spain, the once formidable Armada was reduced to a shattered remnant of its former glory. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked a turning point in world history. England's survival secured its sovereignty, bolstered its naval prestige, and laid the foundation for its rise as a global maritime empire. Closer to home, however, England's ambitions extended beyond the seas. The Crown sought to consolidate its control over Ireland, which at the time was divided between 2 distinct spheres: the Pale, centered around Dublin and under direct English rule, and the vast Gaelic Irish regions, which maintained traditional autonomy under Brehon law. As English influence expanded, new policies and land reforms threatened the Gaelic way of life, igniting resentment among Irish lords. One man stood at the heart of this growing conflict: Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. A man of noble birth and sharp political acumen, O'Neill was torn between loyalty to the English crown and devotion to his Irish heritage. As ruler of the powerful province of Ulster, he wielded immense influence and soon became the figurehead of Ireland's resistance against English domination. Hugh O'Neill had grown weary of England's ever-increasing demands and the suffering of his homeland under foreign rule. Determined to free Ireland from the grip of the English crown, he raised the banner of rebellion. It was time for resistance. O'Neill called upon the Gaelic lords of Ireland to unite against the occupiers, and among those who answered was Hugh O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, a fierce and valiant warrior in his own right. United in purpose, the two leaders forged a formidable alliance, rallying Irish clans and chieftains across the land. Their cause was clear: to drive out the English and reclaim Ireland's independence. The Crown, alarmed by the uprising, responded swiftly. English armies under commanders such as Sir Henry Bagenal were dispatched to crush the rebellion. What followed was nearly a decade of relentless conflict, the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603. The struggle ravaged the countryside. Villages burned, fields lay barren, and both sides suffered immense losses. For the Irish, it was a desperate fight for sovereignty and faith. For the English, it was a campaign to secure their rule over a land that refused to yield. By 1601, the Irish cause was faltering. Resources were scarce, morale was low, and defeat seemed inevitable. Then, a glimmer of hope appeared. A Spanish expeditionary force landed at Kinsale, seeking to aid the Irish rebels in their struggle against the Protestant English crown. For a moment, victory seemed within reach, but fate was cruel. The decisive Battle of Kinsale ended in disaster. The Irish and Spanish forces, outmaneuvered and surrounded, were crushed by the English army. The dream of a free and united Ireland faded as quickly as it had risen. By 1603, the rebellion was over. Exhausted and outnumbered, O'Neill and his allies surrendered to the English crown, signing the Treaty of Mellifont. The treaty offered pardons and allowed many lords to retain limited lands and religious rights. Yet, beneath its promises lay England's true intent: to dismantle the Gaelic order once and for all. Over the following years, Irish culture, language, and Catholicism were systematically suppressed. The island was reshaped to mirror English customs and governance. Ireland was to be remade, not as a Gaelic nation, but as an extension of the Anglo-Saxon realm. Still, England's ambitions reached far beyond its neighboring isles. The age of exploration and empire had only just begun. Eager to expand across the Atlantic, the English turned their attention once more to the New World. In 1600, the Company of London, better known as the Virginia Company, was founded, with a royal charter to seek wealth, trade routes, and colonies in the Americas. With the blessing of King James I, 104 settlers set sail from the River Thames on December 20th, 1606, braving the freezing winter seas. After a perilous 4-month voyage, on May 13th, 1607, they made landfall on a marshy peninsula along the James River. There, they established the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown, named in honor of their king. As they stepped ashore, the weary settlers were captivated by the wild majesty of the land before them. Towering forests, crystal-clear rivers, and an abundance of wildlife stretched in every direction, a pristine paradise full of promise and peril alike. Little did they know that this small outpost would become the seed from which a vast empire across the Atlantic would grow. But the settlers' dream of paradise quickly turned into a struggle for survival. The unfamiliar climate of Virginia proved harsh and unforgiving. The sweltering heat and suffocating humidity took a heavy toll on the unprepared colonists. Disease spread rapidly through the encampment. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses weakened their bodies and morale. Each day became a fight simply to endure. Worse still, hunger soon followed. The settlers had arrived too late in the season to plant crops, and their food stores dwindled rapidly. The surrounding soil, marshy and saline, yielded little harvest. As supplies ran out, starvation loomed, yet the colonists refused to surrender. They worked tirelessly, scavenging for food, hunting in the wilderness, and searching for a means to sustain their fragile settlement. Desperate to secure aid, they turned to the region's indigenous inhabitants, the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful network of Algonquian-speaking tribes led by Chief Powhatan. Initially, the English sought to trade and coexist, but mistrust and cultural misunderstanding marred their early interactions. The Powhatan viewed the newcomers with suspicion, uncertain of their intentions, while the settlers, struggling to communicate and negotiate, often acted with arrogance and fear. Clashes soon erupted, further endangering the colony's survival. Internal discord compounded the crisis. Leadership within Jamestown was unstable, with competing factions and weak governance undermining unity. When Captain John Smith, the colony's strong-willed and pragmatic leader, departed for England in 1609 after being injured, the settlers were left adrift just as winter approached. The harsh winter of 1609 to 1610, remembered as the Starving Time, became one of the darkest chapters in Jamestown's history. Food supplies were exhausted, and desperation turned to horror. The colonists resorted to eating horses, dogs, rats, and even the leather from their boots. Disease, famine, and conflict with the Powhatan decimated the population. Of the 500 settlers who entered the winter, barely 60 survived to see spring. Yet, from the brink of extinction came a glimmer of hope. In 1610, an enterprising settler named John Rolfe introduced the cultivation of a new strain of tobacco to Virginia. The crop flourished in the region's soil and soon became the colony's lifeline. Tobacco exports brought wealth and renewed purpose, attracting waves of new settlers and transforming Jamestown into a thriving commercial hub. Relations with the Powhatan improved slightly in the years that followed. Through cautious diplomacy and mutual necessity, small bridges of understanding were built. Rolfe himself married Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, symbolizing a brief moment of peace and cooperation between the two peoples. At last, after years of suffering, Jamestown stood as England's first enduring colony in the Americas, proof that the dream of empire across the Atlantic could become reality. Meanwhile, even as Jamestown began to stabilize, England's ambitions stretched farther east. In 1607, English merchant William Hawkins was dispatched to open trade with India. Sailing from the port of Plymouth aboard the Hector, accompanied by a small fleet of 3 ships, Hawkins embarked on a voyage that would lay the groundwork for England's future foothold in Asia, marking the early stirrings of what would one day become the British Empire in the East. The crew aboard Hawkins's fleet was a diverse mix of seasoned sailors, traders, and diplomats, carrying with them fine English goods intended for exchange in faraway lands. Their voyage was perilous, battered by storms and unpredictable seas, but after months of endurance, they reached the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, a key milestone on the route to the east. From there, the ships sailed into the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, pressing onward toward the western coast of India. In 1608, Hawkins' expedition finally arrived at the bustling port city of Surat, one of the most important trade hubs in the Mughal Empire. At that time, India was under the rule of Emperor Jahangir, a patron of art, culture, and international commerce. The emperor, intrigued by new opportunities for exchange, welcomed the English visitors with measured curiosity. Hawkins was soon invited to the imperial court in Agra, near the site where the majestic Taj Mahal would later rise. There, through skilled interpreters, he met Emperor Jahangir face to face. Their discussions ranged from trade to politics and culture, each side seeking mutual advantage. The emperor was captivated by the novelty and craftsmanship of English goods, from fine textiles and weapons to metalwork. After careful negotiation, Jahangir granted the English East India Company permission to establish a small trading post in Surat. This marked the beginning of formal trade relations between England and India, a modest foothold that would, over the coming centuries, grow into the foundation of the British Raj. By 1612, this trading post had become a thriving commercial operation. English merchants exchanged firearms, iron and manufactured goods for Indian textiles, spices, indigo, and other valuable commodities that would soon transform England's economy. The growing partnership was strengthened further in 1615, when a new English envoy, Sir Thomas Roe, arrived at the Mughal court to represent King James I. As Sir Thomas Roe entered the opulent halls of Jahangir's palace, he was awestruck by the grandeur that surrounded him. Brilliantly colored silks draped the walls, jewels sparkled in the lamplight, and the scent of exotic incense hung in the air. No court in Europe could compare to the wealth and sophistication of the Mughal Empire. Roe presented King James's letter of friendship, along with a collection of rare English gifts, fine glassware, clocks, and richly crafted metalwork. Jahangir, impressed by both the gesture and the goods, reciprocated warmly. During his 3 years in India, Sir Thomas Roe secured England's place as a respected trading power in the East, paving the way for centuries of deep economic and political entanglement between the two nations. Back in England, meanwhile, the winds of change were blowing in another direction. King James I had made his religious stance clear. Every subject must be Anglican, or leave the realm. This decree deepened the growing rift between religious conformists and those who sought freedom of worship. For many, the New World began to represent more than opportunity. It symbolized freedom. People dreamed of a distant land where faith could be practiced without interference from the crown or church. The idea of America as a refuge for religious liberty began to take root, inspiring those willing to risk everything to live and worship by their own convictions. Only the most faithful and devout, those who truly longed for the freedom to worship as they chose, dared to embark on such a perilous journey. These brave souls became known as the Pilgrims. In July 1620, two ships, the English Mayflower and the Dutch Speedwell, prepared to set sail from Southampton, England, bound for the New World. However, fate seemed determined to test their resolve. Shortly after departure, the Speedwell developed a severe leak, forcing both ships to turn back for repairs. After several frustrating delays, they set out again, but scarcely 200 miles beyond the coast, near the southwestern tip of England, the Speedwell began leaking once more. It was now early September, and time was slipping away. The Speedwell was declared unfit for the journey, leaving the Pilgrims with a difficult choice. Who would continue aboard the Mayflower, and who would stay behind? The decision was agonizing. Worse still, during the long repairs, the Mayflower's provisions, meant to sustain the settlers across the Atlantic, had been heavily depleted. Yet despite these setbacks, faith carried them forward. At last, on September 16, 1620, the Mayflower set sail alone from Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers and crew. The ship, originally designed to transport wine between England and Bordeaux, was ill-suited for a transatlantic voyage. Still, the Pilgrims' conviction to build a new civilization for God gave them strength. For more than 2 months, they endured horrific conditions. Cramped below deck in semi-darkness, tossed violently by relentless waves, they clung to one another as seawater drenched their clothes and supplies. At one point, a massive storm cracked the ship's main beam, threatening to tear it apart. Despair swept through the passengers, who feared they would either sink or be forced to return home. Then a stroke of providence. One of the settlers had brought along a metal jack screw, a simple device he had purchased in Holland for building homes in the New World. Using it, the crew managed to secure the broken beam, stabilizing the ship and saving the voyage. Through exhaustion, hunger, and sickness, the Mayflower pressed on. At long last, on November 21, 1620, they sighted land, Cape Cod. After 66 grueling days at sea, the Pilgrims had arrived in the New World. Only one life had been lost during the journey. There they established the colony of Plymouth, the first lasting English settlement in New England. But their trials were far from over. The bitter winter that followed brought cold, hunger, and disease. By December, coughing and fever swept through the camp. Malnutrition and scurvy claimed life after life. By spring, only 47 of the original 102 settlers remained alive. Yet through resilience and determination, the survivors endured. They built homes, planted crops, and forged an enduring community, a testament to their unyielding faith and perseverance. As Plymouth struggled to survive, England's colonial ambitions expanded southward. In 1624, explorer Thomas Warner led an expedition to the Caribbean, seeking fertile lands and tropical riches to expand the empire. On January 28, 1624, his group landed on the island of St. Christopher, today known as St. Kitts, where they established England's first Caribbean colony. The island's strategic location made it ideal for trade and agriculture. In 1625, French captain Pierre Belend as Nambuc arrived and joined forces with Warner, forming a joint English-French settlement. Warner welcomed the alliance, partly out of necessity. The colonists had begun to fear the native Kalinago, Carib people, skilled warriors who resisted European intrusion. Thus began England's foothold in the Caribbean, a region that would soon become the heart of its lucrative plantation economy, powered by sugar, slavery, and the relentless pursuit of imperial dominance. The Kalinago, the indigenous people of the Caribbean, known today as the Caribs, had watched with growing alarm as European settlements spread across their islands. In 1626, their chief, Gramont, convened a secret council with other tribal leaders. Together, they resolved to launch a coordinated attack against the European invaders on the night of the next full moon. But their plan was betrayed. A woman named Barbe, who had been captured during a previous Carib raid on the nearby island of Aruba and brought to St. Kitts as a slave wife, revealed the plot to the colonists. Warned in advance, the English and French settlers joined forces and struck first, attacking the Kalinago village under cover of darkness. What followed was a massacre. Between 100 and 120 Caribs were killed that night in their sleep, with only a handful of women spared, enslaved and forced into servitude. The next day, the colonists unleashed even greater brutality. Nearly 4,000 Kalinago men, women, and children were rounded up and slaughtered as they tried to surrender. The killing was so extensive that the nearby river ran red with blood, earning it the grim name Bloody Point. For days afterward, the air was thick with the stench of death, the landscape littered with bodies. With the indigenous population decimated, the colonists were confronted with a new dilemma. Who would work the plantations? The cultivation of tobacco was brutally labor-intensive, and the Europeans refused to do the work themselves. The answer they found would reshape human history. They turned to Africa. Thus began the Caribbean slave trade, as enslaved Africans were forcibly brought across the Atlantic to toil under unbearable conditions in the name of profit. The English, driven by greed and ambition, expanded rapidly across the Caribbean. In 1625, they established a colony in Barbados. In 1627, they settled Nevis, and by 1632, they had founded colonies in Montserrat and Antigua. These islands would soon become the beating heart of England's plantation economy, built on the backs of enslaved Africans and the relentless export of sugar and tobacco. The British Empire was not retreating, it was rising, fueled by commerce, conquest, and cruelty. Meanwhile, back in England, the political and religious climate was growing increasingly volatile. When King Charles I ascended the throne in 1625, he intensified persecution of those who defied the Church of England. His disdain for non-Anglicans, especially the Puritans, who sought to purify the Church of corruption, created a climate of fear and resentment. By 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament altogether, beginning an 11-year period of personal rule. His autocratic governance, combined with religious intolerance, drove many Puritan leaders and merchants to seek refuge elsewhere. The New World beckoned, a land where they could build a society rooted in their faith and free from royal interference. In April 1630, under the leadership of John Winthrop, a respected Puritan minister, a fleet of 11 ships carrying 700 settlers set sail from the Isle of Wight. Their destination? Massachusetts Bay. When they landed in Salem later that year, Winthrop delivered a sermon that would echo through American history, a model of Christian charity. In it, he urged the settlers to live as a community bound by faith and compassion, declaring that their new colony must be a city upon a hill. It was both a spiritual covenant and a political vision, a declaration that this fledgling settlement would serve as a beacon to the world, a symbol of moral purpose, and the foundation of a new kind of society. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was unlike the earlier ventures at Jamestown or St. Kitts. It was not born merely from the pursuit of profit, but from conviction. Its settlers saw themselves as God's chosen people, builders of a divinely inspired society that would serve as a moral example to the world. Guided by faith, discipline, and a strict moral code, they believed their obedience would secure divine favor and place them at the center of history. Over the next decade, nearly 20,000 men, women, and children left England in what became known as the Great Migration. They sought refuge from religious persecution and the chance to build new lives grounded in faith and self-governance. Yet even among the Puritans, differences in belief soon emerged. Some sought stricter adherence to Scripture. Others demanded greater freedom of conscience. These divisions led to the founding of new colonies across New England. In 1636, Thomas Hooker led a group of settlers westward to establish the Connecticut colony, advocating for broader political rights and religious inclusion. But England's religious turmoil extended far beyond New England's shores. Across the Atlantic, Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, pursued a daring plan of his own. In 1632, King Charles I granted him a charter for a vast territory north of Virginia, which he named Maryland in honor of the Catholic Queen Henrietta Maria. The colony was envisioned as a refuge for English Catholics long oppressed under Protestant rule. Though Cecil Calvert never personally set foot in Maryland, his influence was profound. Under his direction, 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove, sailed from England in 1634, carrying both Catholic settlers seeking freedom of worship and Protestant laborers in search of new opportunity. They landed on the banks of the Potomac River and established St. Mary's City, the first settlement of the Maryland colony, a rare early experiment in religious tolerance in the New World. Even within the British Isles, religious and political tensions simmered. In Scotland, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland resisted attempts by King Charles I to impose Anglican reforms. The Scottish people, bound by their national covenant, rose in defiance. When Charles sent 20,000 soldiers northward to force compliance, the Scots met him with an army of 16,500 Covenanters at Berwick in 1639. Outnumbered and facing fierce opposition, Charles hesitated. On May 30th, 1639, he agreed to a temporary truce, promising not to invade Scotland so long as the Covenanters remained north of the border. For now, there was peace, but it was fragile. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, English influence was expanding rapidly. The British East India Company, growing in power and wealth, sought new trade outposts to strengthen its hold over the lucrative markets of Asia. In 1639, the company dispatched 2 agents, Francis Day and Andrew Cogan, to the Coromandel coast of India. They arrived at the bustling port of Madraspatnam, a thriving hub of the Nayak of Poonamali and part of the broader Vijayanagara Empire. Their mission was clear: to secure a permanent English foothold in the region and outmaneuver their European rivals. Through negotiation, they acquired a small tract of land, upon which they constructed a fortified trading post, Fort St. Emans George, the nucleus of what would later grow into the city of Madras, now Chennai. With this outpost, England planted the first firm seed of its future empire in India, a commercial enterprise that would, in time, evolve into political domination. Negotiations with the local Nayak rulers proved intricate and delicate. For months, envoys from the British East India Company exchanged gifts, promises, and diplomatic courtesies, seeking to earn the rulers' favor and secure a coastal foothold. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The company was granted a small tract of land along an upper stretch of the Coromandel coast, a modest parcel of dunes that would soon become the cornerstone of English trade in southern India. With this land secured, the English wasted no time. They erected a simple trading post, a collection of timber warehouses and thatched shelters, to house merchants and goods. Its purpose was straightforward: to facilitate the exchange of Indian textiles, spices, and precious materials for English silver and manufactured goods. The site was christened Fort St. George in honor of England's patron saint, symbolizing divine protection and the company's intent to establish a permanent and sanctified presence in the East. As trade grew, so did tension. The region's complex web of alliances between the Portuguese, Dutch, and local Indian rulers posed constant threats. Piracy, rivalry, and political intrigue surrounded the fledgling outpost. To safeguard their growing enterprise, the company began replacing its wooden structures with sturdy brick buildings, gradually encircling the settlement with defensive walls and bastions. What began as a humble trading hub was evolving into something far greater. Fort St. George was no longer merely a marketplace. It was a symbol of English power and ambition, a strategic foothold from which the East India Company would expand its influence across the Indian subcontinent. While English power solidified in India, unrest brewed closer to home. In Ireland, the Crown's relentless colonization policies had reached a breaking point. Irish Catholics were being systematically stripped of their ancestral lands, which were confiscated and redistributed to English and Scottish Protestant settlers under the plantation system. The dispossessed Irish lords and clans were left impoverished and embittered, forced to the margins of their own country. Resentment exploded in 1641 when a faction of Irish gentry, led by Rory O'More and Sir Phelim O'Neill, launched a rebellion aimed at reclaiming control from the English. Their plan was bold: seize Dublin Castle, the very heart of English authority in Ireland. But fate turned against them. The plot was discovered before it could be executed, forcing the rebels to act prematurely and leading to a disastrous failure. Yet defeat did not extinguish their fury. In November 1641, O'Neill and his followers regrouped and launched new assaults across Ulster, attempting to reclaim their territories. One such attack targeted the town of Garvagh, but the rebels were repelled once again. Frustration and rage consumed them. In retaliation, they struck at Portadown, a settlement that had once belonged to the ancient McCann clan, now replaced by English Protestant settlers under the Crown's orders. What followed would mark one of the darkest and most brutal episodes in Ireland's colonial history. The rebellion reached its most harrowing point at Portadown. There, the Irish insurgents overpowered the local British garrison and took dozens of Protestant settlers prisoner. What followed was an act of vengeance that would forever stain the rebellion's legacy. On a cold autumn day, the captured Protestants were marched to a wooden bridge intentionally broken at its center. Stripped of their clothing and dignity, the prisoners were forced onto the splintered planks and then driven into the icy waters of the river Bann below. Those who tried to swim to safety were shot down with muskets as they struggled against the current. It is estimated that around 100 men, women, and children perished that day. Their screams echoed across the valley long after the river had swallowed them. The massacre at Portadown became a rallying cry for vengeance among the Protestants and would ignite a cycle of retaliatory violence that plunged Ireland deeper into chaos. Reprisals followed swiftly. In Island Magee, Protestant militias slaughtered more than 24 Catholic civilians in cold blood. The bloodshed spread across Ulster and beyond, as both sides committed atrocities that darkened the Irish landscape. In April 1642, a Scottish Covenanter army landed in Ulster to support the Protestant settlers. Their arrival brought new horrors. On Rathlin Island, Scottish troops from Clan Campbell, under the orders of Sir Duncan Campbell, exacted brutal revenge on the local MacDonalds, who were kin to the Campbells' traditional enemies in Scotland. Hundreds of MacDonald women and children were driven to the edge of the cliffs and thrown to their deaths on the rocks below. A massacre so savage it would echo through Scottish and Irish memory for generations. The violence spiraled out of control until Owen Roe O'Neill, a veteran Irish officer who had served in the Spanish army, returned home and took command of the Irish forces in Ulster in July 1642. O'Neill, appalled by the chaos, sought to impose discipline among the rebels. He publicly condemned attacks on civilians and even hanged those responsible, attempting to restore order and moral legitimacy to the Irish cause. Yet, despite O'Neill's efforts, unity among the Catholic leaders remained elusive. Rivalries, regional loyalties, and differing aims fractured the movement. Realizing that they could not fight both England and each other, the Catholic nobility convened in Kilkenny later that year. There, they founded the Confederate Catholics of Ireland, a unified political and military body designed to coordinate the rebellion and present a legitimate government. Their goal was both pragmatic and symbolic, to establish an Irish Catholic state that remained loyal to King Charles I, but demanded recognition of Irish autonomy and the protection of the Catholic Church. The Confederation of Kilkenny established its own parliament, known as the Supreme Council, which governed the country, managed diplomacy, and directed military campaigns. One of the Confederation's defining acts was the creation of a solemn oath, pledging allegiance to both the Catholic faith and the English crown. Every member swore to uphold the Church's rights in Ireland, defend its priests, and protect its people. Within months, nearly all of Ireland's Catholic gentry and nobility joined the movement. Local lords raised armies from their own estates, rallying their dependents to fight not only for their faith, but for their homeland. The Irish Confederation, though fragile, marked the first attempt in centuries to create a unified, self-governing Ireland, an island bound together by faith, defiance, and the dream of sovereignty. As Ireland burned in rebellion, fear spread among English administrators and settlers alike. They worried that once the Protestant colonists were expelled or killed, the Irish peasantry would turn upon them as well. In London, both King Charles I and the Long Parliament responded with uncompromising severity. It was decreed that any Irish Catholic who could not prove loyalty to the crown would be held responsible for the uprising and the massacre of settlers. This threat was formalized in the Adventurers Act of 1642, which promised English investors confiscated Irish lands in exchange for financing the military reconquest of Ireland. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would be crushed, and Irish property would pay for it. Yet this fragile effort to appease both Parliament and the Crown was doomed to collapse, for the entire British Isles were about to descend into civil war. On January 4, 1642, tensions between King and Parliament erupted into open hostility. In an unprecedented act, King Charles I entered the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 prominent members of Parliament: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Holles, Arthur Haselrig, and William Strode. These men were leading voices of resistance against royal absolutism and defenders of parliamentary privilege. Charles accused them of treason, seeking to reassert his authority over a parliament that had grown increasingly defiant. The attempt failed. The 5 members had been warned and escaped moments before the king's arrival. Charles's intrusion into Parliament, an act seen as an unforgivable violation of English constitutional tradition, galvanized opposition against him. The kingdom polarized overnight. By June 1642, Parliament formally presented Charles with the 19 propositions, a sweeping list of demands that would redefine the balance of power between monarch and Parliament. The proposals called for Parliament's supremacy in governance and the curtailment of royal authority. Among their key articles: Proposal 2. All matters of national concern were to be debated and resolved in Parliament, not by the king's private advisers. Proposal 6. Laws against Jesuits, Catholic priests, and recusants were to be strictly enforced. Proposal 7. Catholic peers were to lose their voting rights, and the children of Catholics were to be raised in the Protestant faith. It was clear that Parliament sought not only political control, but also a unified Protestant religious identity for the nation. Charles rejected the document outright. His reply was defiant and final, open quote, "To all these demands, our answer is no. We are unwilling to change the laws of England." Close quote. The line was drawn. By the autumn of 1642, both factions, royalists loyal to the king and parliamentarians fighting for constitutional reform, had raised their armies. England braced itself for war. The first major clash came on October 23, 1642, at Edgehill, in the rolling countryside of Warwickshire. As dawn broke, the mist lifted to reveal 2 vast armies facing one another across the fields. On one side stood the king's royalist forces, led by his nephew Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a brilliant cavalry commander renowned for his daring charges. Opposite them waited the parliamentarian army, disciplined but inexperienced, commanded by Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. The Battle of Edgehill would mark the beginning of one of England's bloodiest conflicts, a war not only for power, but for the soul and future of the kingdom itself. Opposing Prince Rupert on the field of Edgehill stood Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a seasoned and disciplined commander who led the parliamentarian army. As dawn broke, the royalist cavaliers under Rupert charged with ferocious speed, smashing through the parliamentarian left flank. For a moment, it seemed the king's forces had secured a decisive advantage, yet the victory proved fleeting. The royalist infantry failed to exploit the cavalry's early success, allowing Essex's troops time to regroup. The parliamentarian line, though bloodied and shaken, reformed and counterattacked. What followed was a brutal, chaotic melee, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, as England tore itself apart. After 2 days of savage fighting, neither side held the field. The Battle of Edgehill ended inconclusively, but the message was clear. The war for England's future had begun, and neither crown nor parliament would yield. In the months that followed, the royalists gained ground. Bolstered by early momentum, they achieved victories across the south and west. At Braddock Down and Stratton, they crushed parliamentarian resistance, consolidating control over Cornwall. Prince Rupert's daring tactics brought triumph again at Chalgrove Field, though the victory was overshadowed by the death of the parliamentarian hero John Hampden. The Royalist advance continued through 1643, with key successes at Roundway Down and the capture of Bristol, one of England's largest and most strategic cities. For a time, the king's cause appeared unstoppable, and royal authority seemed destined to prevail. But by 1644, the tide began to turn. The parliamentarians, hardened by defeat and strengthened by reorganization, struck back. The decisive confrontation came at Marston Moor, near York. There, under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell and other parliamentarian commanders, the Royalist army suffered a catastrophic defeat, their hold over the north shattered. Later that year, the exhausted armies clashed again at the First Battle of Newbury. Like Edgehill, it ended without a clear victor, but it revealed the parliamentarians' growing resolve and professionalism. A true turning point came the following summer. On June 14, 1645, as dawn rose over the fields of Naseby, both armies prepared for what would decide the fate of England. The Royalists, confident and battle-hardened, faced the parliamentarians, who had been reorganized into a new, fearsome force, the New Model Army. This restructured army, driven by discipline, merit, and faith, embodied Parliament's new vision of warfare. At its core stood Oliver Cromwell and his elite cavalry unit, the Ironsides, renowned for their unwavering courage and strict moral code. The battle began with the thunder of cannon fire echoing across the countryside. Rupert's cavalry once again struck first, scattering parts of the parliamentarian line. For a moment, the Royalists seemed poised for victory, but Cromwell had anticipated this. Holding his Ironsides in reserve, he unleashed them at the crucial moment. With resounding shouts, Cromwell's cavalry charged, cutting deep into the Royalist ranks. Their precision and coordination overwhelmed the king's army. The Royalist line collapsed under the relentless assault. In the aftermath, King Charles I himself was captured and taken prisoner. The war was over. In 1649, after a controversial trial in Westminster Hall, Charles was found guilty of high treason against the people of England. Calm and dignified to the end, he defended his divine right to rule, but his words could not save him. On a cold January morning, the king stepped onto the scaffold outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. With one swift stroke of the executioner's blade, England's monarchy fell. For the first time in its history, the kingdom stood without a king. The age of absolute rule had ended, giving way to a new era of governance, one forged in revolution, faith, and blood. Here's the professionally rewritten continuation, with timestamps removed and restructured into a clear, historically grounded documentary-style narrative. The era of Oliver Cromwell. With the fall of the monarchy, England entered a new and unprecedented phase in its history, the Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell. A devout Puritan, Cromwell believed, like his brethren in Massachusetts, that the Anglican Church had been corrupted by the decadence of kings and the influence of royalists. To him, divine order could only be restored through discipline, reform, and the uncompromising authority of God's word. Under the new Rump Parliament, Cromwell rose to command as Lord General of the army. His first mission was to crush the Irish Confederacy, which remained loyal to Catholicism and to the late King Charles I. To Cromwell, Catholicism represented idolatry, a denial of the Bible's primacy, and had to be eradicated. Landing in Dublin on August 15, 1649, Cromwell's army quickly seized the fortified port towns of Drogheda and Wexford, securing vital supply lines from England. What followed was among the most infamous campaigns in Irish history. At the Siege of Drogheda in September 1649, Cromwell's forces stormed the town after fierce resistance. In the aftermath, his troops slaughtered nearly 3,500 people, including about 2,700 Royalist soldiers, civilians, and Catholic priests. The massacre was intended as a warning to all of Ireland. A month later, at Wexford, another massacre followed. 2,000 Irish troops and 1,500 civilians were killed as the town was burned to the ground. By the spring of 1650, Cromwell's campaign of terror had subdued Ireland. He then turned his attention northward when Scotland proclaimed Charles II, son of the executed king, as the rightful monarch. Seeing this as an act of treason, Cromwell marched on Scotland. On September 3, 1650, he met the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. Against overwhelming odds, Cromwell won a decisive victory, killing 4,000 Scots and taking 10,000 prisoners before capturing Edinburgh. The following year, Charles II and his Scottish allies invaded England, hoping to seize London. Cromwell pursued them relentlessly, crushing their forces at the Battle of Worcester on September 3, 1651, exactly 1 year to the day after Dunbar. It was the final major battle of the English Civil Wars, and it cemented Cromwell's reputation as one of history's most formidable generals. Meanwhile, back in Ireland, the last Catholic strongholds continued to fall. Galway surrendered in April 1652, and by April 1653, the final Irish troops capitulated in County Cavan. The Act for the Settlement of Ireland, 1652, confiscated nearly all Catholic-owned land, redistributing it to English and Scottish settlers, parliamentary soldiers, and creditors. The public practice of Catholicism was banned, and priests were executed when found. Ireland lay devastated, its population reduced by war, famine, and forced displacement. Cromwell's rule extended beyond Ireland. In Scotland, he imposed Anglicanism as the state religion and outlawed Presbyterianism. In 1653, he assumed the title of Lord Protector, ruling the three kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, under a single central authority. Determined to civilize the Highlands, Cromwell dismantled the clan system that had defined Scottish society for centuries. Before his reforms, land was held communally by clans with resources shared for survival. Cromwell abolished this structure, granting individual land ownership to clan chiefs, who became a new Scottish nobility. The once communal Highlands transformed into a society of landlords and tenants. These new landowners, driven by English economic ideals, sought profit rather than community. They deforested vast stretches of Scotland's ancient woodlands to clear land for sheep pastures, ushering in an ecological and social upheaval. The old Highland way of life collapsed, and countless Scots were reduced to poverty, laboring on lands that had once been their own. Cromwell viewed this transformation as progress, a spreading of English order and civilization. Yet in truth, he had shattered an ancient culture. Cromwell's ambitions, however, extended far beyond the British Isles. Seeking to challenge Spanish dominance in the Americas, he launched the Western Design in April 1655, a naval expedition to seize Spanish territories in the Caribbean. The fleet's goal was to project English power across the Atlantic, securing colonies that could rival Spain's wealth in sugar and silver. In April 1655, General Robert Venables led the English Armada on an ambitious expedition known as the Western Design. The mission, to strike at Spain's colonial strongholds in the Caribbean and assert English dominance in the New World. Their first target was the fortified Spanish city of Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. But the campaign began in disaster. Poor planning, lack of coordination, and tropical disease ravaged the English forces. The Spanish defenders, seasoned by years of warfare and familiar with the terrain, repelled the siege with fierce determination. The English army, decimated and demoralized, was forced to retreat. Unwilling to return home in disgrace, Venables sought an easier conquest. His sights turned to the island of Jamaica, a relatively undefended Spanish possession. In May 1655, nearly 7,000 English soldiers landed near the island's capital, Spanish Town, and quickly overwhelmed the colony's 2,500 inhabitants. Jamaica fell into English hands, marking the beginning of England's Caribbean Empire. The Spanish made several attempts to retake the island, but none succeeded. Cromwell declared Jamaica an English colony and used it as both a strategic outpost and a penal colony. English prisoners of war, political dissidents, and criminals were transported to Jamaica as indentured servants, forced to labor under brutal tropical conditions cultivating sugarcane. Disease, heat, and hunger claimed countless lives, but the plantation economy took root. By 1660, Cromwell's reign had ended. The Protectorate collapsed, and England, weary of military rule, restored the monarchy. King Charles II, son of the executed king, returned to the throne, ushering in the Restoration era. Charles II was determined to rebuild England's prestige abroad, granting it exclusive rights over the gold trade and, by 1663, access to the transatlantic slave trade. The company's forts and ships became integral to England's growing dominance in West Africa, as tens of thousands of enslaved Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic to labor in the colonies. Across the Atlantic, Charles sought to strengthen England's presence in North America. In 1663, he chartered the province of Carolina, named in his honor, granting vast lands to 8 loyal nobles. The new province stretched across territories that today include North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and parts of Florida. The colony was meant to serve as a buffer against Spanish Florida and to expand England's agricultural wealth through rice, indigo, and tobacco plantations. Meanwhile, competition in Africa intensified. The Dutch, long dominant in coastal trade, had established powerful forts along the Gold Coast. Unwilling to tolerate Dutch control, Charles II authorized Captain Robert Holmes to seize their positions. On January 22, 1664, Holmes captured Gorée Island off Senegal. By April 10th, he had taken Cape Coast Castle, one of the Dutch's principal fortresses in West Africa. England now held the upper hand in the region's lucrative trade in gold and in human lives. But the rivalry between England and the Dutch extended far beyond Africa. Across the Atlantic, the English set their sights on New Amsterdam, a prosperous Dutch settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. On May 25, 1664, Colonel Richard Nicolls sailed from Portsmouth with 4 warships and 300 soldiers. Upon arriving on August 27th, he presented the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, with generous terms of surrender. Residents would retain their property, freedom of religion, and the right to keep their taverns open, without the strict moral codes of Puritan New England. Realizing resistance was futile, the Dutch settlers agreed. New Amsterdam was surrendered peacefully and renamed New York, in honor of the king's brother, the Duke of York. Outraged by England's bold seizure, the Dutch retaliated. The brilliant naval commander Admiral Michiel de Ruyter set sail to reclaim lost territory. In early 1665, his fleet recaptured the Dutch forts along the West African coast and destroyed English ships near Barbados. But his forces, weakened by tropical illness, could not retake New York. De Ruyter withdrew to Europe, and 2 years later, the conflict was formally ended by the Treaty of Breda, 1667. Under the treaty, England retained New York permanently, while the Dutch regained Suriname, a rich sugar-producing colony in South America. The agreement marked a balance of colonial power, but also cleared the way for England's next great expansion across the Americas. To the north, another European rival remained, the French. Their colony in Canada, centered on Montreal, had grown slowly and cautiously. The French preferred to sustain their settlements through the lucrative fur trade, especially the prized beaver pelts that were in high demand across Europe. Among the most daring of these traders were Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers, 2 French explorers who learned from the Cree peoples of the vast, fur-rich territories northwest of Lake Superior. Ignoring French restrictions on unlicensed trade, the 2 men ventured deep into this uncharted land. When they returned to Montreal, laden with furs of extraordinary quality, they provided proof of the immense wealth that lay in the Hudson Bay region. But instead of being celebrated, they were punished. The French authorities arrested them for trading without authorization, confiscated their furs, and fined them heavily. Outraged, Radisson and Groseilliers turned to a new potential patron, England. Determined to exploit the riches of Hudson Bay, they would soon approach King Charles II, setting in motion the creation of one of the most powerful trading companies in world history. After their arrest and punishment by the French, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers turned to the English for support. In 1668, they approached a group of colonial merchants in Boston, Massachusetts, seeking financing for a northern expedition. When that failed, they traveled to London, where they won the patronage of Prince Rupert of the Rhine, cousin to King Charles II. With royal backing, 2 ships were commissioned for their voyage, the Nonsuch and the Eaglet. Their mission was to explore the trade potential of the Hudson Bay region. Groseilliers sailed aboard the Nonsuch under Captain Zachariah Gillam, while Radisson joined Captain William Stannard aboard the Eaglet. On June 5, 1668, both ships departed from Deptford, England, but storms forced the Eaglet to turn back near Ireland. The Nonsuch pressed onward, navigating treacherous northern waters until it reached James Bay, the southern inlet of Hudson Bay. There, the crew established a small fortified trading post at the mouth of the Rupert River, which they named Charles Fort in honor of the king. Over the winter of 1668 to 1669, Groseilliers and his men traded with the local Cree for furs, amassing a rich cargo. When the Nonsuch returned to England in October 1669, its hold was filled with pelts of extraordinary value. The fur cargo was sold to London merchant Thomas Glover for £1,233, the equivalent of about $188,000 today. The expedition proved that the Hudson Bay region could sustain profitable trade, and in 1670, King Charles II granted a royal charter to form the Hudson's Bay Company. The charter gave the company exclusive control over all lands whose rivers drained into Hudson Bay, a vast territory known as Rupert's Land. It would become one of the most powerful commercial empires in history, and astonishingly, the Hudson's Bay Company still exists today. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, England's colonies were expanding at a remarkable rate. In 1624, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had just 180 settlers. By 1675, its population had swelled to 64,000, straining land and resources. Colonists began expanding beyond their coastal settlements, pressing deeper into indigenous territories to secure farmland and timber. This expansion placed them in direct conflict with the Wampanoag Confederacy, whose ancestral lands surrounded Plymouth Colony. At first, relations between the two peoples had been cordial. The Wampanoag, under their leader Massasoit, had helped the early Pilgrims survive. But over time, the balance shifted. As English settlements grew, disputes over land ownership intensified. To the English, land was a commodity, something that could be owned, bought, and sold with a legal deed. To the Native Americans, land was communal, shared among the people, and held in trust for future generations. Misunderstandings escalated into resentment and eventually open hostility. The breaking point came in 1675. 3 Wampanoag men were executed by English authorities for the alleged murder of a Christianized Native American named John Sassaman. To the Wampanoag, this was an outrage, a symbol of English arrogance and injustice. Their new leader, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, rallied neighboring tribes to war. The conflict, known as King Philip's War, erupted in June 1675, beginning with raids on Swansea, then spreading to Taunton, Brookfield, and Deerfield. Entire towns were burned, and both settlers and indigenous communities suffered terrible losses. The winter brought no peace. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion ravaged both sides. In December, English forces launched a brutal counterattack against the Narragansett tribe allies of Metacom at the Great Swamp Fort in Rhode Island. Hundreds of native men, women, and children were killed. As the war dragged on, the English sought new allies, forging an alliance with the Mohawk to outflank Metacom's forces. By 1676, the rebellion was collapsing. Betrayed by one of his own men, John Alderman, a Christian convert known as a praying Indian, Metacom was ambushed and killed. His death marked the end of organized native resistance in southern New England. The Treaty of Casco formally ended the war in August 1676. Under its terms, native tribes were allowed to remain on their lands, but the English demanded an annual tribute. 1 peck of corn per English family living on native territory. A peck was only 16 dry pints, symbolically small, yet it underscored English dominion over the region. The cost of the war was catastrophic. Thousands dead, entire villages destroyed, and native culture across New England forever changed. Back in England, new religious dissenters were emerging to challenge the Church of England. Among the most radical were the Quakers, followers of George Fox, who preached that every person possessed an inner light, a divine spark enabling direct communion with God, independent of priests or kings. The Quakers rejected all titles and hierarchies. To them, everyone was equal in the eyes of God. Kings were addressed simply by their first names, and even parents were not called mother or father, but by name alone. Such ideas horrified the Anglican elite, who viewed the Quakers as dangerous subversives. One man, however, sought to create a refuge for them. William Penn, the son of a wealthy English admiral, had inherited a debt owed to his father by King Charles II, £16,000, or about £2.8 million in today's money. Instead of demanding repayment in cash, Penn requested land in the New World where his fellow Quakers could live freely. On March 4, 1681, King Charles II granted him a vast territory west of the Delaware River, naming it Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods. In October 1682, Penn arrived aboard the ship Welcome and founded a small settlement he called Philadelphia, derived from Greek, meaning City of Brotherly Love. His vision was bold and idealistic. A city and colony where people of all faiths, races, and genders could coexist in peace, free from persecution. Philadelphia would become a symbol of tolerance and liberty, principles that would one day shape the foundation of a new nation. William Penn's holy experiment in Pennsylvania stood apart from every other English colony. It was a place, in theory, where no one would be persecuted for their faith, a refuge where a white man and a black man could shake hands as equals, as Penn famously described it. Guided by his Quaker belief that all people are equal under the eyes of God, Penn envisioned a society rooted in tolerance, brotherhood, and divine equality. But as Penn's utopia began to flourish in the New World, turmoil engulfed England once more. In 1685, King Charles II died, and his brother James II, a staunch Roman Catholic, ascended the throne. James sought to grant religious freedom across his dominion, an act that alarmed the Anglican majority, who viewed Catholicism with suspicion and fear. Defying the Test Act, which barred Catholics from holding public office, James appointed several to positions of power. To his Protestant subjects, this was a dangerous overreach. But the real crisis came in 1688, when James's Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son. The newborn prince represented a potential Catholic dynasty, threatening to undo a century of Protestant ascendancy. Behind closed doors, 7 influential nobles and politicians, later known as the Immortal Seven, plotted to remove the king. They feared not only religious backsliding, but the rise of absolutism, where the monarchy would eclipse Parliament and the rule of law. Their solution lay in James's own family. They invited William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law and husband to his daughter Mary, to intervene. In November 1688, William landed on the southern coast of England with a large invasion fleet. What followed would be remembered as the Glorious Revolution. James II, abandoned by many of his supporters and deserted even by members of his army, fled to France under the cover of night. With his departure, the English throne stood vacant. In 1689, William III and Mary II were crowned joint monarchs, but their reign came with a monumental shift in power. That same year, Parliament enacted the Bill of Rights, a cornerstone of English constitutional government. It established Parliament's supremacy over the monarchy, restricted royal authority, and codified civil liberties such as free elections and protection from arbitrary rule. The divine right of kings was over, replaced by the rule of law. News of the Glorious Revolution soon crossed the Atlantic, sparking political upheaval in the colonies. In April 1689, Protestant settlers in New York revolted against the Catholic governor Jacob Leisler, seizing control of Fort James and establishing a provisional government loyal to William and Mary. At nearly the same time, in Boston, colonists rose against the authoritarian governor Sir Edmund Andros, arresting him and restoring their old charter government under the new Protestant monarchs. The fall of Catholic power in England reverberated throughout Europe and beyond. The French, ruled by King Louis XIV, viewed these events as a direct threat to Catholic supremacy. Determined to defend his faith and influence, Louis rallied his armies, but Europe united against him. The Dutch Republic, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire joined England in the Grand Alliance, determined to halt French expansion. The conflict erupted in 1690 with battles spanning the globe. In Europe, the Battle of Fleurus saw the French secure a costly victory against Allied forces in the Spanish Netherlands, strengthening Louis XIV's hold over the region. But the war's true scale was unprecedented. It extended across continents and oceans. In Ireland, the deposed James II sought to reclaim his throne with French support. His forces clashed with those of King William III at the Battle of the Boyne on July 1, 1690. The confrontation, fought along the winding river north of Dublin, ended decisively in William's favor. The victory secured his reign and cemented Protestant control over both England and Ireland. The war stretched far beyond Europe. Across the Atlantic, in North America, the struggle between England and France took on a new form. In Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia, English forces launched an assault on the French port of Port Royal, attempting to dislodge their rivals. The attack failed, but the fighting soon spread through the northern frontier. Alliances between European powers and indigenous nations turned the New World into a global battleground. In Maine, French and Abenaki raiding parties attacked English frontier towns, burning settlements and driving colonists into panic. The Siege of Pemaquid highlighted the shifting loyalties and devastating cost of these conflicts. Further north, the Battle of Quebec saw English colonial forces attempt to capture the French stronghold in Canada, hoping to strike a decisive blow against New France. But the expedition faltered. Poor coordination, harsh weather, and disease decimated the attackers. The English were forced to retreat, leaving Quebec in French hands. Though indecisive militarily, these early colonial wars marked the beginning of a much larger struggle, a century-long rivalry between England and France for control of North America, the Caribbean, and the world's trade routes. By the late 17th century, the rivalry between England and France had escalated into a global struggle for dominance. After nearly a decade of warfare across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, the conflict finally came to an end on September 20th, 1697, with the signing of the Treaty of Ryswick. The treaty formally recognized William of Orange as King of England, confirming the legitimacy of his rule after the Glorious Revolution. It also brought a temporary halt to France's continental offensives, restoring a fragile peace across Europe and the colonies. Yet while cannons fell silent in the West, another front of imperial rivalry was already burning in the East. In India, the English East India Company, which had long enjoyed a trading monopoly under Mughal permission, began to test the limits of its authority. Seeking to expand beyond commerce into territorial control, the company's leadership attempted to gain ownership of Chittagong, establish fortified settlements along the coast, and secure independence from Mughal oversight. But the reigning emperor, Aurangzeb, refused. The company's demands were an affront to his sovereignty. Tensions rose quickly. Blockades were imposed, trade routes disrupted, and by 1686, open hostilities erupted in what became known as the Anglo-Mughal War. The company's navy blockaded several Mughal ports, including those near Chittagong, Madras, and Bombay, provoking a harsh imperial response. Emperor Aurangzeb ordered the seizure of all English trading posts and the imprisonment of company personnel. In 1690, Mughal Admiral Sidi Yaqub laid siege to the English stronghold in Bombay, trapping its garrison and cutting off supplies. For over a year, famine and disease ravaged the defenders. When the fort finally capitulated, the East India Company was humiliated and forced to plead for forgiveness. Their envoys appeared before Aurangzeb's court, prostrating themselves before the emperor and offering a fine of 150,000, the equivalent of £4.4 million today. Aurangzeb, satisfied by their submission, ordered Sidi Yaqub to lift the siege. The company was granted permission to resume operations, though under stricter supervision. Humbled but wiser, the English shifted their focus to a new location, Calcutta, which would one day become the center of British rule in India. The Union of England and Scotland. While the East India Company was re-establishing its foothold in Asia, political transformations were reshaping the British Isles. After the death of William III, the crown passed to Queen Anne in 1702, ushering in a new era of constitutional evolution. At the time, the British Isles were a mosaic of distinct realms: England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, each with its own parliament or local laws, but united under a single monarch. Wales had long been assimilated into English governance, and Ireland remained under English dominance, but Scotland still retained a measure of independence. However, by the early 18th century, Scotland was struggling with economic turmoil, failed colonial ventures, and widespread corruption. Many members of the Scottish elite saw political union with England as a means of stability and profit. English negotiators, eager to secure the northern frontier and expand a unified market, offered generous incentives and bribes. Prominent Scottish officials such as David Boyle, Earl of Glasgow, and James Douglas, the second Duke of Queensberry, accepted payments totaling £20,000, over £4 million today, to support the merger. Despite fierce opposition from ordinary Scots, the Acts of Union were ratified. On May 1st, 1707, the Parliament of Scotland was dissolved, merging with England's legislature to form the Parliament of Great Britain, seated at Westminster. Though the Union promised shared prosperity, it extinguished Scottish sovereignty. Anger simmered in the Highlands and among the common people, but England celebrated. For London's politicians, this was not merely a political merger. It marked the birth of Great Britain and the dawn of a new empire. The peace established by the Treaty of Ryswick proved short-lived. In 1701, the death of Charles II of Spain without an heir plunged Europe back into turmoil. Two rival claimants emerged: Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg, and Philip of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France. The possibility of uniting the French and Spanish thrones under one Catholic dynasty terrified the English. A single Bourbon monarchy controlling Western Europe could upend the balance of power and spread Catholic influence worldwide. Determined to prevent it, England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire declared war on France and Spain in what became known as the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Though fought primarily in Europe, the war's reach extended to the Americas and beyond. It was a global conflict, one of the first of its kind. In North America, the fighting erupted between English and French colonies. The first clash came at Fort Albany in the Hudson Bay region, where Commander Claude de Ramsay led French troops against the English trading post. Despite brave resistance behind wooden palisades, the fort fell under heavy French cannon fire. The victory strengthened French influence in Canada and along the northern frontier. But the English retaliated. In Acadia, modern Nova Scotia, British commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch led a determined campaign to capture Port Royal, the French stronghold guarding the Bay of Fundy. As English warships appeared on the horizon, their cannons thundered against the fort's walls. Inside, Governor Daniel Dodger de Subercase led a spirited defense. For weeks, the siege raged day and night, the air thick with the roar of muskets and the crack of artillery. Finally, on October 5, 1710, recognizing defeat, Subercase raised the white flag. The gates opened, and English troops marched into Port Royal. The French banner was lowered, replaced by the Union Jack, and the settlement was renamed Annapolis Royal in honor of Queen Anne. Acadia was now under English control, a major step toward dominance in North America. The Treaty of Utrecht and the Asiento de Negros. The War of the Spanish Succession concluded with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, signed in the Netherlands. The treaty confirmed Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, as King of Spain, but on the condition that the French and Spanish crowns would never unite. While this preserved Europe's political balance, it was another clause that proved far more consequential for the British Empire, the Asiento de Negros. This agreement granted Britain the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's colonies in the Americas. Before Utrecht, this contract had been held by France. With it transferred to England, Britain gained near-total control of the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would generate immense wealth while inflicting unimaginable human suffering. Under the Asiento, the Royal African Company, and later the South Sea Company, transported tens of thousands of enslaved Africans each year to the Caribbean and Spanish America. Sugar, tobacco, and human lives became the currency of empire. It was a chilling irony. As Britain celebrated its new status as the world's leading maritime and commercial power, its prosperity was built on the enslavement of millions. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 not only ended the War of the Spanish Succession, but redrew the map of colonial power. France ceded Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Rupert's Land in North America to the British, while Spain surrendered Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean. These new acquisitions gave Britain control over key trade routes and naval strongholds, solidifying its growing dominance across the Atlantic world. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another transformation was underway in the English colonies of North America. The once unified province of Carolina split into two distinct entities, North Carolina and South Carolina. The division, formalized in the early 18th century, reflected stark differences in geography and economy. South Carolina, with its fertile lowlands and warm, humid climate, was ideal for rice, indigo, and sugarcane cultivation, and thus quickly became a jewel of the British Empire. North Carolina, by contrast, was poorer, less arable, and sparsely populated. As wealth flowed into Charleston's harbors, so too did enslaved Africans, imported in growing numbers to fuel the colony's booming plantation economy. To tighten control over this enslaved labor force, the South Carolina Assembly passed one of the most infamous documents in colonial history, the Slave Code of 1712. This legislation codified the brutal system of racial slavery into law, declaring that, open quote, Negroes and other slaves brought unto the people of this province are of barbarous, wild, and savage natures, wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws and customs of this province. Close quote. The code imposed severe restrictions and horrific punishments. Enslaved Africans were forbidden to leave their plantations without written permission or the company of a white person. Any white colonist could legally whip or chastise a slave found wandering. Runaways faced escalating punishments: public whippings for the first offense, branding with an R on the cheek for the second, loss of an ear for the third, and castration or death for the fourth. This barbaric law became the template for slave codes across the American colonies and the Caribbean. It revealed in chilling clarity how deeply the institution of slavery had been woven into the foundations of Britain's new empire. By 1712, there were roughly 4,000 enslaved people in the mainland colonies, but in the Caribbean, that number soared into the hundreds of thousands. The islands of Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands had become the economic engines of the empire, powered by sugarcane, the most profitable and labor-intensive crop in the world. On the plantations, enslaved Africans endured unimaginable conditions. Under a scorching tropical sun, often exceeding 38 degrees 100 degrees Fahrenheit, they cleared vast tracts of jungle by hand, planted sugarcane shoots, dug irrigation canals, and labored for 16 to 18 hours a day. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and tropical disease killed thousands each year. Once harvested, the cane was crushed and boiled in sweltering mills, filling the air with thick, burning steam. The death toll was staggering. To maintain production, Britain's slave traders transported over 200,000 Africans to the Americas between 1710 and 1720 alone. As one historian later remarked, sugar did not always taste sweet. While slavery fueled the fortunes of the Caribbean and southern colonies, one man envisioned a different path. James Oglethorpe, a British general and philanthropist, sought to create a refuge for England's poor, a colony where debtors and struggling families could start anew. In November 1732, Oglethorpe and 144 colonists departed from Gravesend, England, aboard the ship Anne. After a grueling transatlantic voyage, they landed on February 12, 1733, founding the colony of Georgia at Savannah. Unlike its neighbors, Georgia initially banned slavery. Oglethorpe believed that every colonist should cultivate their own land, ensuring a modest but sustainable livelihood rather than vast plantations and extreme wealth. He also feared that slavery would undermine the colony's security, for just south lay Spanish Florida, where enslaved Africans were promised freedom if they escaped and joined the Spanish army. This ban on slavery, however, was short-lived. Economic pressures and planter greed would eventually erode Oglethorpe's vision. The War of Jenkins' Ear. Even before Georgia's founding, tensions between Britain and Spain had been rising. The conflict began with a single gruesome incident. In 1731, British merchant captain Robert Jenkins was captured by a Spanish patrol while smuggling goods in the Caribbean. As punishment, a Spanish officer cut off Jenkins' ear and told him to deliver it to his king as a warning. Years later, Jenkins presented his preserved ear before the British Parliament, sparking outrage among the public and politicians alike. Calls for revenge swept through London. Diplomacy dragged on for nearly a decade, but by 1740, the two nations were at war. That January, General James Oglethorpe led British troops from Georgia into Spanish Florida, capturing Fort Picolata and Fort San Francisco de Pupo. Emboldened by early success, he advanced toward the heavily fortified St. Augustine, but soon realized his small force could not withstand the Spanish defenses and withdrew. The Spanish retaliated in the summer of 1742, landing thousands of soldiers on St. Simon's Island, at Georgia's southern tip. There, Oglethorpe and his men prepared for battle, fortifying the narrow marshlands and waiting for the enemy's approach. What followed would become one of the defining moments of the colonial South, the Battle of Bloody Marsh, where the fate of Britain's youngest colony would hang in the balance. On the humid afternoon of July 7, 1742, British Rangers scouting near Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, stumbled upon a detachment of Spanish soldiers. Acting swiftly, General James Oglethorpe led his men in a surprise counterattack. The startled Spanish troops scattered, retreating into the dense coastal marshes. Anticipating another assault, Oglethorpe returned to Frederica and ordered his men to fortify the road leading to the fort. Hours later, a second Spanish regiment advanced through the swamps, only to fall into a deadly ambush. English troops, concealed among the marsh grasses, opened fire. The clash that followed became known as the Battle of Bloody Marsh, named for the crimson water that soaked the reeds that day. When the smoke cleared, the Spanish were in full retreat. They withdrew to St. Augustine, effectively ending Spain's ambitions in Georgia. Oglethorpe's defense had secured Britain's southern frontier, and the battle marked the last Spanish invasion of the 13 colonies. Yet the War of Jenkins' Ear was far more than a local skirmish. It had evolved into a global conflict, stretching from the Caribbean to India. Across the oceans, the same imperial rivalry played out in southern India, in the rich and contested region known as the Carnatic. There, British ambitions collided with French expansion under the leadership of Joseph-François Dupleix, the charismatic and cunning Governor-General of French India. The English, allied with the Nawab Anwar-ud-Din Muhammad Khan, supported his claim to the throne of the Carnatic. Dupleix, however, backed his rival, Chanda Sahib, forging a Franco-Indian alliance that would alter the balance of power in the region. In 1744, open hostilities erupted. At the Battle of Adyar, French-trained Indian forces crushed their English-backed opponents, demonstrating the effectiveness of European-style warfare in Indian conflicts. 2 years later, in 1746, Dupleix launched an audacious assault on Madras, the key English settlement on the Coromandel coast. Outnumbered and surrounded, the British garrison surrendered. Madras was placed under French control, a severe blow to English prestige in India. But fortune would soon turn. The War of the Austrian Succession. At the same time, Europe was engulfed in another war, this time over the succession to the Austrian throne. The death of Emperor Charles VI had left his daughter, Maria Theresa, as heir to the Habsburg dominions, sparking a massive continental struggle known as the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. The great powers, France, Spain, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, and Britain, all became entangled in a complex web of alliances. In the Netherlands, the British, Dutch, and Austrians joined forces under William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, to halt French expansion. In 1747, the armies met in the Battle of Lafeld. Despite fierce fighting, the combined British and Dutch forces could not break through the formidable defenses commanded by Marshal Maurice de Saxe, one of France's greatest generals. Though the battle ended in stalemate, both sides were exhausted. When diplomacy resumed in 1748, cooler heads prevailed. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle restored the status quo ante bellum, returning captured territories to their pre-war owners. Madras, despite being lost in battle, was returned to the British, while France regained its colonies in India. The treaty also established a formal boundary between British Georgia and Spanish Florida, marked by the St. Johns River, and recognized Austria under Maria Theresa as an independent state. It was a diplomatic victory for Britain, achieved not through conquest, but through negotiation. After the war, the question of slavery once again dominated debate in Georgia. Oglethorpe, steadfast in his moral opposition, fought to maintain the colony's original ban. But enforcement proved impossible. Enslaved people were being smuggled in from South Carolina, where the slave economy flourished. The settlers, many of them poor laborers who had hoped for independence, grew resentful. They watched their southern neighbors amass wealth from slave-driven plantations and demanded the same freedoms to profit. Reluctantly, the ban collapsed. On January 1, 1751, Georgia officially legalized slavery, adopting a code nearly identical to South Carolina's. The social transformation was immediate and profound. Within 2 decades, the colony's wealthiest 60 planters owned roughly half of Georgia's enslaved population, establishing an elite ruling class and replicating the plantation hierarchy of the Carolinas. Oglethorpe's dream of a refuge for the worthy poor had failed. Georgia was now a slave society. and part of Britain's growing web of plantation colonies. The Ohio Valley and the approach of war. While the South entrenched itself in slavery, the northern colonies were turning their eyes westward. Beyond the dense forests of Pennsylvania and Virginia lay the Ohio Valley, a vast region of fertile land, towering trees, and rich fur-bearing animals. In 1748, the Ohio Company of Virginia was founded by a group of influential investors, including Augustine Washington, father of George Washington. Their mission was to claim and develop this western territory for profit. Young George Washington, then a teenage surveyor, was tasked with mapping and evaluating the company's land holdings. Trekking through the wilderness, he soon discovered a troubling reality. The land was already inhabited by the Shawnee and Delaware tribes, both wary of British expansion. Even more concerning, the French were already there, establishing forts and trading networks that linked the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. Their fur trade with native nations had flourished for generations, and they had no intention of surrendering this lucrative region. The seeds of the next great imperial conflict, the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French